The letter fell from Clara Bennett's hand before she finished reading the second line. Her fingers had gone cold. Outside the window of the small study, rain hit the glass in hard, quick bursts, and somewhere down the hall a clock struck 10, but Clara did not move. She stood frozen, staring at the paper on the floor as if it might change its meaning if she looked at it long enough. The letter was from Lord Percy Ashworth, a family friend who wrote to the Duke of Ashfield on matters of business. But it was not business that had stopped Clara's breath. Buried in the third paragraph, almost as an afterthought, was a single line that would change everything. The Duke, it said, had agreed to marry Lady Cassandra Vale before the end of the year. Clara pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady herself. She had known, of course, that a match was being discussed. Everyone in the house had known. But knowing a thing might happen and reading that it had already been decided were two very different griefs. She bent down, picked up the letter with shaking fingers, and folded it carefully, as though careless hands might tear more than paper. For 9 years, Clara had lived in Ashfield Manor. She had come to the house as a girl of 12, an orphan with no fortune and no name worth mentioning, taken in by the old Duchess out of kindness after Clara's parents died in a fire that took their small cottage and everything in it. The Duchess, Lady Margaret, had never treated Clara as a servant, not exactly. She was something in between, a companion, a helper, a quiet presence who managed the household accounts, read to the Duchess in the evenings, and kept the great house running smoothly while everyone else seemed too busy or too grand to notice the small details that held a home together. And in all those years, Clara had loved Alden Whitmore, Duke of Ashfield, with a quiet, patient devotion that she had never once spoken aloud. She could still remember the first time she saw him properly, not as a boy running through the gardens with his tutor chasing behind him, but as a young man returning from his studies at 18, tall and serious, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that seemed to carry more weight than a young man's eyes should. He had nodded to her politely that day, the way a nobleman nods to any member of the household, and walked past without another thought. Clara, 17 at the time, had stood in the hallway long after he left, her heart beating strangely in her chest, and she had known, with the simple certainty of youth, that something in her had changed forever. It was a foolish thing to love a duke. Clara understood that. She was the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress, raised on charity in a house far grander than anything she could have imagined as a child. Alden Whitmore would marry a woman of rank, a woman with land and connections, and a name that could strengthen his family's position. Clara had no illusions about her place in his world. And yet knowing a thing did not stop the heart from wanting it. She had told herself over the years that her feelings were harmless as long as she kept them hidden. She would serve the household well. She would care for the ailing Duchess with real tenderness, not because it was expected of her, but because she had come to love the old woman as her own family. She would manage the estate's daily troubles quietly, solving problems before they reached the Duke's desk, smoothing arguments between servants, catching mistakes in the accounts that could have cost the family dearly. She told herself this was enough. She told herself that being near him, being useful to him, being trusted by his household, was a kind of happiness she had no right to ask for more than. But some nights, when the house was quiet and she sat alone by the small fire in her room, Clara allowed herself to imagine a different life. She imagined Alden noticing her, truly noticing her, not as the woman who kept his accounts in order, but as a woman he might choose to love. She imagined a conversation where his eyes lingered on hers a moment too long, where his voice softened when he spoke to her, where he asked after her day not out of politeness, but out of real interest. These imaginings never lasted long. She always caught herself, scolded herself gently, and folded the dream away like a letter she knew she should never send. Now, standing in the study with Lord Ashworth's letter in her hand, those careful, guarded dreams collapsed all at once. Cassandra Vale. Clara knew the name well. Lady Cassandra had visited Ashfield Manor twice in the past few months, each time arriving with a great deal of luggage and an even greater deal of confidence. She was beautiful in the way that portraits are beautiful, every feature placed with perfect symmetry, every gesture practiced until it looked natural. She was also, Clara had noticed with quiet unease, the kind of woman who smiled warmly at those who mattered and looked straight through those who did not. Clara had been one of the ones looked through. During Cassandra's first visit, she had asked Clara to fetch her a shawl, mistaking her for one of the housemaids. When Clara gently explained that she was the Duchess's companion, Cassandra had simply raised an eyebrow, as if the distinction meant very little, and repeated her request in exactly the same tone. Clara had fetched the shawl without complaint. It was not the first time she had been mistaken for staff, and she had long ago stopped feeling wounded by such moments. Or so she told herself. But something about Cassandra's manner unsettled her in a way she could not quite name. It was not simply coldness. It was calculation. Cassandra watched the household the way a merchant studies a shop before deciding what to buy, weighing every person and object for its usefulness. And when her sharp eyes had settled on Clara during that first visit, lingering a moment too long, Clara had felt, quite suddenly, like a rival being measured rather than a servant being dismissed. She had told herself she was imagining things. Now, with the letter in her hand, she understood that her instincts had been right all along. Footsteps sounded in the hallway outside the study, familiar and unhurried, and Clara barely had time to smooth her expression before the door opened. It was Henry Combs, the household's long-serving butler, a stout man with silver hair and kind eyes who had watched Clara grow from a frightened girl into a capable young woman. He paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of her pale face and the folded letter still trembling slightly in her hand. "Miss Bennet," he said gently, closing the door behind him, "you look as though you've seen a ghost." Clara managed a small, unconvincing smile. "It's nothing, Henry, just a letter from Lord Ashworth regarding the autumn accounts." Henry's eyes did not waver from her face. In 9 years, he had learned to read Clara the way one reads a well-worn book, noticing the small changes others might miss. "Autumn accounts do not usually bring that look to a person's eyes," he said quietly. Clara's composure wavered just slightly, and Henry stepped closer, lowering his voice as though the walls themselves might be listening. "It's the engagement, isn't it? You've heard." There was no point pretending, not with Henry. Clara nodded once, her throat tight. "It's official, then." "Lady Cassandra." Henry's expression softened with something that looked almost like pity, and Clara hated it, hated that even kind old Henry could see straight through the careful walls she had built around her heart. "The staff have suspected for some weeks," he admitted. "The Duke has been under a great deal of pressure from his late father's debts. A marriage to Lady Cassandra would settle a good deal of that trouble. Her family's fortune is considerable." "Of course," Clara said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice sounded, even as something inside her chest felt as though it were slowly cracking. "It makes sense. It is a sensible match." "Sensible," Henry repeated, watching her carefully, "is not always the same as right." Clara looked away, unwilling to let him see too much. "The Duke must think of his family's future. That is his duty. I would not wish him to think of anything less." Henry said nothing for a long moment, and in his silence Clara heard everything he was too respectful to say aloud. He knew, as surely as she knew herself, where her heart had settled years ago and never left. But it was not his place to speak of it, and it was not hers to admit it, not even to herself in that moment, standing in a study with rain against the windows and her whole quiet, patient hope crumbling into pieces at her feet. "The Duchess is asking for you," Henry said finally, his voice gentle. "She had a difficult night. Her cough has returned." The mention of the old Duchess pulled Clara instantly out of her own troubles, the way it always did. Whatever pain sat in her own chest, it would have to wait. Lady Margaret needed her, and that mattered more than anything else in that moment. She smoothed her skirt, tucked the letter into the pocket of her dress, and followed Henry out of the study and up the wide staircase toward the Duchess's rooms. The house felt different as she walked through it, though nothing had changed except what she now knew. The portraits along the hallway seemed to watch her with new understanding. The grand rooms, the polished floors, the tall windows that let in the gray autumn light, all of it belonged to a world that had never truly been hers, no matter how long she had lived within its walls. She had been foolish to forget that, even for a moment, even in the private corners of her own heart. She found Lady Margaret propped against a mountain of pillows, her thin frame swallowed by the large bed, her breathing shallow but steady. The old Duchess's eyes brightened the moment Clara entered the room, and some of the tension in Clara's shoulders eased at the sight of that familiar warmth. "There you are, my dear," Lady Margaret said, her voice weak but affectionate. "I was beginning to think you had abandoned me for the gardens." "Never," Clara said, crossing the room and taking the old woman's frail hand in both of hers. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Old," the Duchess said with a small, wry smile, "and tired of doctors who tell me things I already know." She studied Clara's face for a moment, and though her body had grown weak with illness, her eyes remained as sharp as ever. "You look troubled, child. What has happened?" Clara hesitated, unwilling to burden the Duchess with her own private grief, but Lady Margaret had never been a woman easily fooled. "Nothing that need concern you," Clara said softly. "Rest now. I'll read to you if you'd like." The Duchess did not press further, though the knowing look in her eyes told Clara she had not been fooled at all. She simply squeezed Clara's hand, a small gesture of comfort, and settled back against her pillows. "Read to me, then," she said. "And Clara, whatever it is that troubles you, know that this house is fortunate to have you in it. Whatever else changes, remember that." Clara nodded, blinking back the sudden warmth in her eyes, and reached for the book on the bedside table. As she began to read, her voice steady despite the storm inside her, she thought of the letter folded in her pocket, of Cassandra Vale's calculating smile, and of Alden Whitmore, who did not yet know that the woman who had quietly loved him for 9 years was standing just down the hall from where his future had already been decided without her. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the house, a decision had been made that would change the course of every life within these walls, though not one of them yet understood how far its reach would go. The dining hall at Ashfield Manor had never felt so large to Clara as it did that evening, though she had eaten dinner within its walls 1,000 times before. The long table stretched between her and the Duke like a river she could not cross, and at its head sat Alden Whitmore, freshly returned from London, his dark coat still dusted from the road, his face drawn with the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent many hours arguing about money he does not have. Clara sat near the far end of the table, in the seat she always occupied, close enough to be useful and far enough to be forgotten. It was a position she had grown used to over the years, and most evenings she hardly noticed it. Tonight, though, every small distance between herself and the Duke felt like a wound freshly opened. "The roads from London grow worse every year," Alden was saying to Henry, who stood near the sideboard overseeing the meal. 3 hours longer than it ought to have taken." "A great deal of rain this season, Your Grace," Henry replied evenly. Alden rubbed his temple, and for a moment the weight he carried was plain on his face. The debts, the estate, the endless demands of a title that had been handed to him too young, when his father died and left behind more obligations than fortune. Clara watched him from her end of the table, cataloging the small signs of his exhaustion the way she always did, and felt the familiar ache of wanting to ease his burden and knowing she had no right to try. "You've been quiet tonight, Miss Bennet," Alden said suddenly, and Clara startled, unprepared to find his attention turned toward her. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, straightening in her chair. "I was thinking of your mother's health. She had a difficult night." His expression shifted immediately, concern replacing exhaustion. "Is she worse?" "The physician says it is only a passing cough brought on by the cold," Clara said gently. "She is resting comfortably now. I sat with her most of the afternoon." "Thank you," Alden said, and there was real warmth in his voice, the kind that always made Clara's chest tighten with a hope she tried desperately to suppress. "I don't know what this household would do without you, Miss Bennet. You manage everything so quietly that half the time I forget how much falls to you." It was, perhaps, the kindest thing he had said to her in months, and it should have brought her joy. Instead, sitting there with Lord Ashworth's letter still folded in the drawer of her writing desk upstairs, Clara felt only the sharp sting of irony. He valued her quiet usefulness. He did not see her as anything more, and now, it seemed, he never would. "It is my honor to serve this household, Your Grace," she said, and the words came out steadier than she felt. The meal continued, and talk turned, as it always did lately, to matters of the estate's finances, to tenant farms that had underperformed that season, to a roof that needed repair before winter set in fully. Clara listened, as she always did, filing away small details she might later use to help solve some problem before it grew larger. It was a habit so ingrained in her now that she hardly thought of it as anything special. It was simply what she did, what she had always done. It was Henry, near the end of the meal, who finally brought up the subject that hung over the table like a storm cloud no one wished to name. "Your Grace," he said carefully, setting down a fresh decanter of wine, "shall I begin preparations for an announcement? The staff have been asking whether they ought to expect guests for a celebration." Alden's fork paused halfway to his mouth. For a moment, something flickered across his face, not quite hesitation, not quite certainty, an expression Clara had rarely seen him wear. Then it smoothed away, and he set the fork down with careful precision. "Yes," he said, "you may begin preparations. Lady Cassandra and I will announce our engagement within the fortnight." The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water, and though Clara had already known, had read it in a letter hours before, hearing it spoken aloud in his own voice was an entirely different kind of pain. She kept her face perfectly still, the way she had trained herself to do over years of small disappointments, and said nothing at all. "Congratulations, Your Grace," Henry said, his voice carefully neutral. "A joyous occasion for the house." "Yes," Alden said again, though something in his tone suggested the word tasted strange in his mouth. "It will settle a great many difficulties. Lady Cassandra's family has been most generous in the terms they've proposed." Clara forced herself to speak, because staying silent felt suddenly more dangerous than saying something ordinary. "I'm sure it will be a fine match, Your Grace. Lady Cassandra is a woman of considerable accomplishment." Alden's eyes lifted to hers then, and for one strange, suspended moment, Clara thought she saw something searching in his gaze, as though he were looking for a reaction she was determined not to give. But it passed quickly, and he simply nodded. "Yes, she is." The rest of the meal passed in ordinary conversation, weather and roofs and tenant farms, and Clara ate very little, though she made certain no one noticed. When at last she was excused, she rose from the table with practiced grace, wished the Duke a good evening, and walked from the dining hall with her spine perfectly straight, though inside something had gone terribly quiet, as if a part of her had simply stopped speaking. She did not go to her room. Instead, she found herself walking out into the gardens, where the autumn air was sharp and cold, and the rain had finally stopped, leaving the world washed clean and glistening under a pale moon. She walked the familiar gravel paths without any real destination, past the roses that had begun to wilt with the changing season, past the old stone bench where she had sat as a girl of 12, frightened and grieving, on her very first night at Ashfield Manor. She sat down on that same bench now, 9 years later, and allowed herself finally to cry. It was not loud weeping. Clara had never been the sort of woman who wept loudly, even in her most private moments. It was quiet, controlled, the tears sliding down her face while her shoulders remained still, as though even her grief had learned to be discreet in a house where she had always been expected to take up as little space as possible. She did not hear the footsteps on the gravel path until they were nearly upon her. "Clara!" She startled, wiping quickly at her face, and looked up to find Grace Milton standing before her, a basket of mending balanced on her hip, her plain wool shawl pulled tight against the evening chill. Grace was Clara's closest friend in the world, the daughter of the village seamstress, a woman with a sharp tongue and an even sharper sense of loyalty, who had known Clara since they were both girls and had never once judged her for the strange, in-between position she occupied at the manor. "Grace," Clara said, trying and failing to steady her voice, "I didn't expect you this evening." "I came to drop off the mending for the Duchess's linens," Grace said, setting the basket down and settling onto the bench beside her friend without waiting for an invitation. "Though it seems I've found something far more important to attend to." Clara tried to smile, but it wavered and broke, and before she could stop herself, the whole story came pouring out. The letter from Lord Ashworth. The announcement at dinner. 9 years of careful, silent love that had just been quietly and permanently closed off by a decision made without her ever having had the chance to hope out loud. Grace listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with every word. And when Clara finally fell silent, spent and hollow, Grace reached over and took her hand firmly. "You have loved that man for 9 years," Grace said, "and in 9 years has he ever once told you how he feels? Has he ever once looked at you the way you look at him?" Clara opened her mouth to defend him, an old habit, but found she had no defense ready. "He has always been kind to me," she said instead, weakly. "Kind?" Grace repeated, and there was real frustration in her voice now. "Clara, a man can be kind to a dog and never once think to marry it. Kindness is not love. You have spent 9 years pouring your whole heart into a man who barely notices you exist beyond how useful you are to his household." The words stung precisely because Clara knew in the quietest, most honest part of herself that they were true. "What would you have me do?" she asked, her voice cracking. "I have no fortune, no name, nothing to offer a duke. I never expected him to love me. I only hoped, foolishly, that perhaps someday—" "Someday is not a plan," Grace said gently, though her grip on Clara's hand did not loosen. "Someday is a wish you keep telling yourself so you never have to face today. Clara, you are 26 years old. You are clever and capable and kind, and you have spent nearly a decade of your life making yourself smaller so that you might fit quietly into the corner of a house where you will never truly belong, not as anything more than a servant with a gentler title." Clara flinched, but Grace pressed on, her voice softening now, though no less firm. "I love you too dearly to watch you disappear into that role for another 9 years. You deserve to be seen, Clara, truly seen, not simply relied upon. And if the Duke cannot see you, then perhaps it is time you stopped waiting in a place where you will always be invisible." The words settled over Clara like a cold wind, uncomfortable and clarifying all at once. She looked out at the darkened gardens, at the great stone house rising behind them with its lit windows and its long history, a house that had given her shelter and purpose but never, not once, given her the one thing her heart had quietly ached for. "I don't know how to leave," Clara admitted softly. "This is the only home I have known since I was 12 years old. Lady Margaret needs me. The household depends on me." "The household depended on you," Grace corrected gently, "because you made yourself indispensable, hoping it might someday translate into something more. But Clara, a house can always find someone else to manage its accounts. It cannot replace the years you are spending waiting for a love that may never come." Clara said nothing for a long while, staring at her hands in her lap, at the small calluses on her fingers from years of careful work, work that had never once been done for herself. Somewhere behind them, the lit windows of Ashfield Manor glowed warmly against the night, and inside one of those windows, she knew, Alden Whitmore was likely already thinking of wedding preparations, of a future that had no place in it for her. "I need time," she said finally. "I cannot simply walk away from everything I have built here in a single evening." "No one is asking you to," Grace said, softening further, squeezing Clara's hand once more before releasing it. "But promise me you will think on it, truly think on it. You have given this house 9 years of your heart, Clara. You do not owe it the rest of your life as well." Clara nodded slowly, though her chest still ached with a grief too large to fully understand in one evening. The two women sat together on the old stone bench for a while longer, saying little, simply keeping each other company beneath the cold autumn sky, until at last the chill grew too sharp to bear, and they rose together to walk back toward the warm, glowing windows of a house that had shaped nearly all of Clara's life, and that she was only now beginning to understand she might someday have to leave. That night, lying awake in her small room long after the rest of the household had gone quiet, Clara stared up at the shadowed ceiling and thought of everything Grace had said. She thought of 9 years of careful devotion, of small kindnesses mistaken for something deeper, of a hope she had nursed so quietly, and for so long that she had almost forgotten it was a choice, and not simply a fact of her life. She thought of Cassandra Vale's calculating smile, and of Alden's voice announcing his engagement at the dinner table, steady and certain, as though the decision had cost him nothing at all. And for the first time in 9 years, Clara allowed herself to imagine, however faintly, a life beyond the walls of Ashfield Manor. A life where she was not simply useful but seen. A life where she did not have to make herself smaller to belong. It was only a seed of a thought, fragile and uncertain, but once planted, Clara found she could not quite make it disappear. Lady Cassandra Vale arrived at Ashfield Manor 3 days later with an entourage that seemed far too large for a simple visit to discuss wedding arrangements. 2 carriages rolled up the long gravel drive, loaded with trunks of gowns and boxes of ribbons, and a lady's maid who complained loudly about the state of the country roads before she had even stepped down from the carriage. Clara watched the arrival from an upstairs window, her hands folded neatly in front of her, and felt something settle heavily in her chest, a weight she suspected would not lift for a long while. By the time Cassandra swept into the grand entrance hall, shaking rain from her fine traveling cloak, the entire household had assembled to greet her, as was proper for the future Duchess of Ashfield. Alden stood at the front of the gathered staff, offering his hand to help Cassandra from the last step of the carriage, and Clara, standing near the back beside Henry, watched the small courtesy with a hollow feeling she had grown almost used to over the past several days. "Alden, darling," Cassandra said, her voice carrying easily across the hall, "this rain is simply dreadful. I do hope the roads will improve before the wedding, or none of my family will manage to arrive in time." "The roads are always troublesome this time of year," Alden replied, and Clara noted, with the careful attention she paid to everything concerning him, that his voice held none of the warmth she had heard when he spoke of his mother's health, or even when he had thanked Clara at dinner days before. It was polite, measured, the voice of a man performing a role rather than living a genuine moment. Cassandra's sharp eyes swept over the assembled staff with the practiced efficiency of a woman taking inventory, and when they landed on Clara, they paused for just a moment longer than they had on anyone else. "Ah," Cassandra said, a small, cool smile touching her lips. "Miss Bennet, is it? The Duchess's companion." "Yes, my lady," Clara said, offering a proper curtsy. "Welcome to Ashfield Manor." "How thoughtful of you to remember my name," Cassandra said, though the words carried an edge Clara could not quite name, something between amusement and dismissal. "I understand you manage a great deal of the household's daily affairs. How very useful you must be." There was something in the way Cassandra said useful, a slight emphasis that made the word feel smaller than it should have, and Clara felt her spine stiffen even as she kept her expression carefully pleasant. "I do what I can to be of service, my lady." "Of course you do," Cassandra said, already turning her attention back to Alden, the conversation with Clara clearly finished before it had properly begun. "Now, Alden, you simply must show me the East Wing. I have several ideas for how it might be improved before we are married." Clara watched them walk away together, Cassandra's hand resting lightly on Alden's arm, her voice already listing changes she intended to make to a house that had stood, largely unaltered, for generations. Something in Clara's chest twisted painfully at the sight, and she was grateful when Henry touched her elbow gently and murmured that the Duchess would need her assistance preparing for the midday meal. The days that followed fell into an uneasy rhythm. Cassandra's presence filled the house with a restless, demanding energy entirely different from its usual quiet order. She rearranged furniture without consulting anyone, dismissed long-serving staff decisions with a wave of her hand, and seemed to delight in finding small faults with the household's management, faults that, more often than not, landed squarely on tasks Clara had carefully overseen for years. "The linens in the guest quarters are simply not up to standard," Cassandra announced one afternoon, standing in the doorway of the study where Clara sat working through the estate's accounts. "I trust someone will see to it before my mother arrives." I'll have it attended to immediately, my lady, Clara said evenly, setting down her pen. See that you do. Cassandra's gaze drifted over the ledgers spread across the desk, and something calculating flickered in her expression. You manage the accounts as well. How resourceful. I confess I'm surprised the Duke allows a woman with no formal training to handle matters of such importance. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she kept her voice steady. I have managed the household's accounts for several years, my lady, with the Duchess's full confidence. The Duchess's confidence, Cassandra repeated, a small smile playing at her lips, is not quite the same as the Duke's, is it? Once we are married, I imagine a great many things about this household will need to be reorganized. Properly this time. She left the room without waiting for a response, and Clara sat alone in the study for a long moment, staring at the columns of neat figures she had spent 9 years learning to keep in perfect order, and feeling, for the first time, truly uncertain of her place within them. It was not only Cassandra's words that troubled Clara in those days, but the things she overheard, quite by accident, in the quiet corners of the house where servants often went unnoticed. One afternoon, passing the drawing-room with an armful of freshly pressed linens, Clara paused when she heard Cassandra's voice, low and confiding, speaking to her lady's maid. This house is dreadfully behind the times, Cassandra was saying. Once we're married, I intend to modernize everything, the furnishings, the staff, all of it. Half these servants have been here since the old Duke's time. They'll need to go, of course, once I've established my own household properly. And the Duke's mother, my lady? The maid asked. The Duchess is unwell, Cassandra said, her tone carrying no real concern, only calculation. I doubt she'll trouble us for very long, and when she's gone, that companion of hers, Miss Bennet, will have no further use here. I'll see her sent off with the rest of the old staff. A house like this needs a fresh start, not a collection of the previous Duchess's charity cases. Clara stood frozen in the hallway, the linens clutched tightly against her chest, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might give her away. She had known, in some quiet, guarded part of herself, that Cassandra saw her as an obstacle, or at best an inconvenience. But hearing it spoken so plainly, so coldly, as though Clara's 9 years of devotion and service amounted to nothing more than clutter to be swept away, struck her with a force she had not expected. She did not linger to hear more. She turned quietly and walked away, her steps quick and unsteady, and did not stop until she reached the small privacy of her own room, where she finally allowed herself to breathe. That evening, Clara found an unexpected moment alone with Alden. She had gone to the library to return a book the Duchess had finished, expecting the room to be empty at that late hour, and was startled to find Alden seated near the fire, a glass of wine untouched on the table beside him, staring into the flames with the particular stillness of a man lost deep in thought. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Clara said quickly, moving to retreat. "I didn't know you were here. I'll come back another time." "No, stay," Alden said, and something in his voice, tired and unguarded, made her pause. "Please, I could use the company if you don't mind." Clara hesitated, then stepped further into the room, setting the book down on a nearby table. "Is something troubling you, Your Grace?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Everything, it seems, these days." He gestured vaguely toward the wine, untouched. "I keep telling myself this marriage is the right decision. The estate's debts will be settled. My mother will be cared for. The tenants will have security for years to come. And yet—" He did not finish the sentence, and Clara found herself holding her breath, waiting. "And yet," he continued finally, "some nights I lie awake wondering if I've traded away something I won't be able to name until it's already gone." Clara's heart clenched painfully at his words, though she kept her expression carefully composed. "Marriage built on duty is not without its own kind of honor, Your Grace," she said softly. "You are securing your family's future. That is no small thing." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." He looked up at her then, and for one brief, suspended moment, something in his gaze seemed to search hers, searching for what Clara could not say. "You've always had a way of putting things plainly, Miss Bennet. I find I trust your judgment more than most." "You flatter me, Your Grace." "I don't think I do," he said quietly. "I think in 9 years, you may be the one person in this house who has never once asked anything of me for herself. Do you know how rare that is?" Clara's throat tightened, and for one wild, foolish moment, she thought she might tell him everything. 9 years of quiet love folded away like an unsent letter, waiting only for this moment to finally be spoken aloud. But before she could find the courage, or perhaps before she could lose it entirely, the library door opened and Cassandra swept in, her expression sharpening the instant she took in the scene before her, Alden seated by the fire, Clara standing close beside him. "Alden, there you are," Cassandra said, her voice bright but her eyes cool as she looked between them. "I've been searching everywhere. And Miss Bennet still hard at work at this hour. How devoted you are." The warmth that had briefly filled the room evaporated instantly. Alden rose from his chair, his expression shifting back into the careful, dutiful mask he wore in Cassandra's presence. "Cassandra, I was simply discussing a household matter with Miss Bennet." "Of course you were," Cassandra said, though her tone suggested she believed nothing of the sort. Her gaze flicked to Clara, cold and pointed. "You may go, Miss Bennet. I'm sure you have other duties awaiting you." Clara curtsied and left the room without another word, her heart still racing from the conversation that had nearly happened, and from the one that had followed it, reminding her precisely where she stood, and precisely how quickly that fragile, unspoken moment could be swept away. Walking back to her room through the darkened halls of Ashfield Manor, Clara thought of Grace's words on the garden bench days before. "You have loved that man for 9 years, and in 9 years, has he ever once told you how he feels?" Tonight had come closer than any night before it to an answer, and yet it had ended, as it always did, in silence, interrupted before it could become anything real. She thought, too, of Cassandra's words in the drawing-room, cold and certain, dismissing 9 years of Clara's life as though it were nothing more than clutter awaiting removal. A house like this needs a fresh start, not a collection of the previous Duchess's charity cases. Perhaps, Clara thought as she reached her room and closed the door softly behind her, Cassandra was not entirely wrong. Perhaps it was time to consider a fresh start of her own, one that did not depend on a man too bound by duty to ever truly see her, and did not depend on a house that had never quite been hers to keep. The seed Grace had planted days before had begun, slowly and painfully, to take root. Winter crept over Ashfield Manor slowly, the way it always did in that part of the country, first with a sharpness in the morning air, then with frost silvering the garden hedges, and finally with the first true snowfall that blanketed the estate in a hush of white. Inside the great house, however, the atmosphere carried little of winter's quiet peace. Preparations for the wedding continued at a demanding pace, and with them, the small, unseen labors that fell, as they always had, upon Clara's shoulders. It began with the matter of the tenant farms. Late one evening, while reviewing the estate's accounts before the fire in the study, Clara noticed an error that made her blood run cold. A payment owed to nearly a dozen tenant families, money meant to help them through the harsh winter months after a poor harvest, had somehow been miscalculated in the ledgers, leaving a shortfall that, if left uncorrected, would mean hardship for families who depended entirely on the estate's support. Worse still, the mistake had originated from a decision Cassandra had made weeks earlier, reallocating funds toward wedding preparations without fully understanding how the estate's finances were structured. Clara sat with the ledgers long past midnight, working through columns of figures by candlelight, searching for some way to correct the error before it caused real harm. She found it eventually, a careful reshuffling of accounts that would cover the tenant payments without drawing attention to the mistake, quietly setting things right the way she always did, without complaint, without credit, and without anyone in the household ever learning how close disaster had come to their doorstep. She brought the corrected accounts to Alden the following morning, presenting them simply as routine paperwork requiring his signature. He signed without asking many questions, trusting her judgment as he always had, and thanked her briefly before turning his attention to a letter from his solicitor. Clara left his study with the quiet satisfaction of a crisis averted, and the equally quiet ache of knowing that no one, least of all Alden, would ever understand what she had spent the previous night protecting. It was not the only sacrifice of that winter. When the Duchess's cough worsened again in the deepest, coldest weeks of the season, it was Clara who sat by her bedside through long, sleepless nights, pressing cool cloths to the old woman's fevered brow, reading to her in a low, soothing voice until exhaustion finally pulled Lady Margaret into fitful sleep. Cassandra visited the sick room exactly once, standing near the doorway for a few uncomfortable minutes before declaring the air too stifling and excusing herself. Alden visited more often, his concern for his mother genuine and deep, but his time was consumed increasingly by wedding preparations and estate matters, leaving him little opportunity to sit through the long hours that illness demanded. It was always Clara who remained. "You look tired, my dear," Lady Margaret said one night, her voice weak but her eyes as perceptive as ever, watching Clara from her pillows as she prepared a fresh cup of tea sweetened with honey for the old woman's raw throat. "I'm well, my lady," Clara said, offering a small smile as she helped the Duchess sit up enough to drink. "Rest is what you need now, not worry over me." "I worry over you a great deal, Clara," Lady Margaret said softly, once she had taken a few careful sips. "More than you know. You have given this family everything, and I fear we have given you very little in return." "You gave me a home, my lady, when I had none," Clara said gently. "That is not nothing." "It is not enough," the Duchess said, with surprising firmness for a woman so weakened by illness. "A home is not the same as being truly valued within it. I have watched you these past 9 years, Clara, watched you pour your heart into this household while asking for nothing, while making yourself smaller and quieter so that no one would ever have cause to question your place here. I am an old woman, and I have not much longer in this world, but I would rest easier knowing that you had found, somewhere, a life that saw you fully and not merely for your usefulness." Clara's eyes stung with unexpected tears, and she busied herself smoothing the blankets over the Duchess's legs to hide them. "Please don't speak of such things, my lady. You will recover, and I have no wish to be anywhere else." But the old woman only shook her head slowly, and reached out to take Clara's hand in her thin, papery fingers. "You are a far braver woman than you believe yourself to be, my dear. Someday, I hope, you will find the courage to prove it, even if it means walking away from all of us." The words settled deep in Clara's chest, echoing there long after the Duchess had drifted into sleep, and Clara sat alone in the dim, candle-lit room, keeping her quiet watch as she always did. It was around this time that Grace introduced Clara to Lord Edmund Hale. Edmund was a distant cousin of Grace's employer, a gentleman of modest but comfortable means who had come to the village to oversee the sale of a small property he had inherited nearby. He was, by every measure Clara could observe, an unremarkable sort of man in the best possible way, kind without performance, thoughtful without calculation, entirely lacking the sharp edges that seemed to define so much of life within Ashfield Manor's walls. They met properly at the village market, where Clara had gone to purchase remedies for the Duchess's cough, and where Edmund, entirely by accident, knocked a basket of herbs from a stall directly into her path while reaching for his own purchases. "I do apologize," he said immediately, crouching to help her gather the scattered bundles, his ears reddening slightly with embarrassment. "I'm afraid I have never quite mastered the art of moving carefully through a crowded market." Clara laughed genuinely for the first time in what felt like many weeks. "No harm done, sir, though I confess my basket has seen better days." "Allow me to replace it at the very least," he said, straightening with a rueful smile as penance for my clumsiness. She protested that it was entirely unnecessary, but Edmund insisted with such good-natured persistence that she eventually relented, and the two of them ended up walking together through the market, talking easily about nothing of particular importance: the weather, the coming winter, a shared fondness for old poetry that neither had expected to discover in a chance conversation among market stalls. It was, Clara realized later, the first conversation she had enjoyed in a very long while that had asked absolutely nothing of her beyond simple, unguarded company. "Your friend speaks very highly of you," Edmund said, as they parted ways near the edge of the market square. "Grace tells me you manage a great household with remarkable skill." "Grace is generous," Clara said, though something warm bloomed in her chest at the compliment, unfamiliar in its simplicity. "I don't think generosity has much to do with it," Edmund said, studying her with a gentle, thoughtful expression that made Clara feel, strangely, as though he were truly looking at her, rather than through her or past her, toward something more useful. "I think perhaps you are simply not accustomed to hearing the truth spoken plainly." Clara did not know how to respond to that, and Edmund, seeming to sense her discomfort, offered a small, kind smile and took his leave with a promise, spoken lightly but sincerely, that he hoped their paths would cross again before he returned to his own estate in the spring. Walking back toward Ashfield Manor that afternoon, Clara found herself turning the conversation over in her mind, comparing it, almost against her will, to the countless conversations she had shared with Alden over the years, conversations that had always circled back, eventually, to duty, to household matters, to the quiet, careful distance he maintained even in his kindest moments. Edmund's conversation had asked nothing of her beyond her own company, had valued her thoughts simply because they were hers, not because they were useful. It was a small thing, perhaps, but small things, Clara was beginning to understand, had a way of adding up into something that could no longer be ignored. That evening, Grace found Clara in the Manor's kitchen garden, gathering the last of the season's herbs before the frost claimed them entirely. "Well," Grace asked, falling into step beside her, "what did you think of Edmund?" "He seems very kind," Clara said carefully, though a small smile tugged at her lips despite herself. "Kind," Grace repeated, arching an eyebrow. "That word again. Though I suspect you mean something different by it this time." Clara considered the question seriously, turning it over in her mind as she continued gathering the last of the rosemary. "He asked about my thoughts on poetry," she said finally, and seemed genuinely interested in the answer, rather than simply being polite while waiting for his turn to speak. "That," Grace said with satisfaction, "sounds like a man worth a second conversation." Clara did not answer immediately, her thoughts drifting, unbidden, back toward the library, toward Alden's tired voice by the firelight admitting some quiet doubt about the marriage he had chosen out of duty rather than love, toward the moment that had almost become something real before Cassandra's arrival had ended it. She thought of 9 years of careful, patient devotion, and of one single afternoon at a market stall that had asked nothing of her beyond simple company. "I don't know what I want any more, Grace," Clara admitted quietly. "I have spent so long wanting one particular thing that I hardly know how to want anything else." Grace stopped walking and turned to face her friend fully, her expression softening with real affection. "Then perhaps it is time to learn," she said gently. "Not for his sake, Clara. For your own." Clara said nothing, but as she finished gathering the last of the herbs and turned back toward the great house rising against the darkening winter sky, she found herself, for the first time in 9 long years, genuinely uncertain of what her own heart truly wanted, and genuinely willing, for the first time, to consider that the answer might not be the one she had spent nearly a decade waiting for. The engagement ball arrived at the end of winter, when the last of the snow still clung stubbornly to the shaded corners of the garden, but the air had begun to soften with the first faint promise of spring. Ashfield Manor had not seen such a grand gathering in years, not since the old Duke's time, and for weeks the household had labored to prepare for it, polishing silver, airing out the great ballroom's heavy curtains, arranging flowers that had to be brought in from greenhouses miles away, since the garden itself offered nothing yet but bare branches. Clara had thrown herself into the preparations with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else, coordinating with the kitchen staff over the menu, overseeing the arrangement of chairs and tables, smoothing over a dozen small crises that arose in the days before the event, a delayed shipment of candles, a musician who fell ill and needed swift replacement, a disagreement between 2 footmen that threatened to disrupt the evening's careful choreography. By the night of the ball itself, The great house gleamed with candlelight and fresh flowers, and not a single guest arriving through its doors would ever guess how much unseen labor had gone into making the evening appear effortless. Clara had not expected to attend the ball itself, not truly, not as a guest among the assembled nobility. Her place, as always, was meant to be in the background, ensuring the evening ran smoothly while others danced and celebrated. But Lady Margaret, insistent despite her continued frailty, had summoned Clara to her rooms that afternoon and pressed a beautiful gown into her hands, deep blue silk, that had once belonged to the Duchess herself in her younger years, carefully altered to fit Clara's smaller frame. "You will attend as my guest tonight," Lady Margaret said firmly, brooking no argument despite her weakened voice. "You have given this family 9 years of devoted service, Clara. Tonight, you will not spend the evening in the shadows. You will stand among us properly, as you deserve." Clara had protested, gently but earnestly, uncertain whether she wished to spend an entire evening watching Alden and Cassandra receive congratulations as a newly announced couple. But the Duchess would not be moved, and in the end, Clara found herself standing before a mirror that evening, dressed in deep blue silk, her hair carefully arranged by Lady Margaret's own maid, looking, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like a woman rather than a quiet fixture of the household's daily machinery. She did look beautiful. Even Clara, who had never thought much of her own appearance, could not deny the truth of it as she studied her reflection. The blue silk brought out warmth in her eyes she had never noticed before, and the careful arrangement of her hair softened features she had long considered plain and unremarkable. For one brief, fragile moment, standing alone in her small room, Clara allowed herself to imagine walking into that ballroom and being seen, truly seen, by the one person whose gaze she had spent 9 years quietly hoping to capture. The ballroom, when she finally entered it, took her breath away with its grandeur, candlelight glittering off crystal chandeliers, the soft strains of a string quartet weaving through air perfumed with fresh flowers, gowns of every color moving gracefully across the polished floor. Clara stood near the edge of the room for a moment, feeling suddenly and acutely out of place despite Lady Margaret's insistence that she belonged there, until Grace appeared at her side, resplendent in a gown of deep green, having been invited as Clara's companion for the evening at the Duchess's own request. "You look stunning," Grace said, squeezing Clara's arm warmly. "I dare say half the room will be wondering who you are." "I feel entirely out of place," Clara admitted, glancing nervously around the crowded room. "Nonsense," Grace said firmly. "You have earned your place in this room 1,000 times over. Now come, let us find something to drink before I lose my nerve entirely and hide in a corner myself." They had barely made their way toward the refreshment table when Clara caught sight of Alden across the room, standing with Cassandra at his side, receiving a steady stream of congratulations from arriving guests. He wore formal evening dress that suited him well, his dark hair combed neatly back, and beside him, Cassandra glittered in a gown of deep crimson, diamonds at her throat, her smile bright and practiced as she accepted compliment after compliment on the upcoming wedding. As if sensing Clara's gaze from across the crowded room, Alden's eyes lifted and found hers. For one long, suspended moment, something shifted in his expression, surprise perhaps, or something deeper that Clara could not quite name as his gaze traveled over the deep blue silk gown, the careful arrangement of her hair, taking her in as though seeing her, truly seeing her for the very first time. Clara's breath caught, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs, and for just an instant she allowed herself to hope. Then Cassandra followed his gaze, and her expression sharpened instantly. "Excuse me a moment, darling," Cassandra murmured to Alden, and before Clara could retreat or find some excuse to slip away, Cassandra had crossed the room toward her, moving with the easy grace of a woman entirely confident in her own dominion. "Miss Bennet," Cassandra said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the small cluster of guests nearby. "How surprising to see you among the guests this evening, rather than attending to your usual duties." "The Duchess was kind enough to invite me, my lady," Clara said evenly. though she felt heat rising in her cheeks at the attention their exchange had begun to draw. "How generous of her," Cassandra said, her smile never wavering even as her eyes swept over Clara's gown with obvious, cutting appraisal. "That gown looks remarkably familiar. Was it not one of the Duchess's own from her younger days? How resourceful of you, to make do with hand-me-downs rather than something of your own." A ripple of uncomfortable amusement passed through the small crowd of onlookers, and Clara felt her face burn with humiliation, though she kept her chin lifted and her voice steady. "Lady Margaret was gracious enough to offer it to me, my lady. I am grateful for the kindness." "Of course you are," Cassandra said, her tone syrupy sweet and utterly merciless. "It must be a rare thing indeed to be invited to stand among your betters for an evening, rather than simply serving them their supper." She turned slightly, addressing the small cluster of guests who had gathered nearby with the easy confidence of a woman entirely sure of her audience. "Miss Bennet has served as my future mother-in-law's companion for many years now, though I confess I sometimes forget precisely where the line falls between companion and housemaid in this particular household." The words landed like a slap, sharper for the casual cruelty with which they were delivered, and Clara heard several small, uncomfortable laughs ripple through the gathered guests. Grace stepped forward immediately, her expression furious, but Clara caught her friend's arm, a silent plea not to make the moment worse. "I am proud of the work I do for this household, my lady," Clara said, her voice trembling only slightly despite the fury and humiliation churning inside her. "There is no shame in honest service." "No shame at all," Cassandra agreed pleasantly, though her eyes held nothing but cold satisfaction. "Though I do wonder how a woman with no fortune and no family name manages to secure herself such a comfortable position within a duke's household. One might almost suspect certain ambitions at play." Her gaze flicked, deliberately, toward Alden, standing several feet away and clearly unable to hear the specifics of the exchange over the noise of the ballroom, though his attention had drawn toward the small crowd with evident concern. "But surely I'm mistaken. A companion knows her place, after all." The implication hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable, and Clara felt something inside her chest crack under the weight of 9 years of careful restraint finally reaching its breaking point. She opened her mouth, searching for some response that might salvage what remained of her dignity, when Alden finally approached, drawn by the tension crackling through the small gathering. "Cassandra," he said, his voice carrying a note of confusion, "what's happened here?" "Nothing at all, darling," Cassandra said smoothly, her expression shifting instantly into warm, untroubled ease as she turned toward him. "Miss Bennet and I were simply having a pleasant conversation about her position in the household. I do hope, once we're married, that we might discuss reorganizing the staff to better suit the needs of a modern household. I have several ideas." Clara looked at Alden, waiting, some small, foolish part of her still hoping he might see through Cassandra's smooth deflection, might recognize the humiliation that had just been inflicted so publicly, and defend her, even now, even after everything. But Alden, exhausted by weeks of wedding preparations and evidently eager to avoid conflict on a night meant for celebration, simply offered Clara a distracted, apologetic smile. "I'm sure whatever discussion you've had, it was well-intentioned," he said, already turning his attention back to Cassandra, already moving past the moment entirely. "Come, darling, Lord Ashworth has been asking after us." And with that, he was gone, drawn back into the glittering crowd of guests, leaving Clara standing exactly where she had stood before, humiliated in front of a room full of strangers, and utterly, devastatingly unseen by the one person whose recognition she had spent 9 years quietly hoping for. Grace's hand found hers, squeezing tightly, and Clara realized distantly that her eyes had filled with tears she was fighting desperately to hold back. "Come," Grace said quietly, urgently, already steering her friend toward the edge of the room. "Let's get you away from here." They found a quiet alcove near the ballroom's tall windows, half hidden behind heavy curtains, and Clara finally allowed the tears to fall, silent and hot, as 9 years of careful hope collapsed entirely in the space of a single humiliating conversation and one distracted, dismissive response. "I'm so sorry," Grace said softly, wrapping an arm around her friend's shaking shoulders. "I should never have let her speak to you that way." "It isn't your fault," Clara managed, her voice thick with tears. "I should have known, I have always known, really. I simply refused to accept it." "Known what?" Grace asked gently. "That I will always be invisible to him," Clara whispered, staring out at the snow-dusted garden beyond the window, silvered under the moonlight. "Not unkind, not cruel, simply unseen. He looked right at me tonight, Grace. For just a moment I thought—" Her voice broke and she pressed a hand to her mouth, steadying herself before continuing. "And then Cassandra humiliated me in front of half the county, and he walked away without a single word in my defense, not because he is cruel. Because he simply did not see how much it mattered. He never has." Grace held her friend close, saying nothing for a long moment, allowing Clara the space to grieve fully, finally, the quiet hope she had carried for 9 long years. "What will you do now?" Grace asked eventually, her voice gentle. Clara wiped her eyes, drawing a slow, steadying breath as something inside her, some fragile, long-held resolve, finally settled into certainty. "I will finish what I came here to do tonight," she said quietly. "I will smile, and I will endure the rest of this evening with whatever dignity I have left. And tomorrow, Grace, I believe it is time I begin considering a life of my own, somewhere far from this house, where I will no longer have to wait for a love that was never truly mine to hope for." Grace squeezed her hand tightly, pride and sorrow mingling in her expression. "It's about time," she said softly. "I'll help you in whatever way I can." "You know that." Clara nodded, drawing herself up straight, smoothing the deep blue silk of her borrowed gown, and steeling herself to return to the glittering ballroom one final time, not as the invisible companion she had been for 9 long years, but as a woman who had finally, painfully, begun to see her own worth clearly, even if the Duke of Ashfield never would. The rest of the evening passed in a careful, practiced blur. Clara smiled where smiling was expected, exchanged pleasant nothings with guests who had no idea of the quiet devastation beneath her composed exterior, and watched, from a careful distance, as Alden and Cassandra danced together beneath the glittering chandeliers, the picture of a perfectly matched couple to anyone who did not know the truth of what lay beneath the surface. When at last the evening drew to a close and the guests began departing into the cold winter night, Clara slipped away to her room, removed the borrowed blue silk gown with careful, steady hands, and sat alone by her small fire long into the night, turning over, again and again, the quiet, resolute decision that had settled itself firmly into her heart. She would leave Ashfield Manor. Not in anger and not in haste, but with the same quiet dignity she had brought to every year of her service there. She owed the household a proper departure, time enough to ensure the Duchess's care was arranged, time enough to leave the accounts in order for whoever might follow her. But she would leave, and this time nothing, not duty, not habit, not 9 years of quiet hope, would convince her to stay in a place where she would always remain unseen. It took Clara nearly 3 weeks to arrange her departure properly, and in all that time, she told no one at Ashfield Manor of her decision except Grace and, eventually, Lady Margaret herself. The Duchess had wept when Clara finally found the courage to share her plans, sitting beside the old woman's bed one quiet afternoon while pale winter sunlight filtered through the curtains. But her tears, Clara noticed with some surprise, were not tears of protest. "I had hoped it would not come to this," Lady Margaret said softly, holding Clara's hand in both of her own frail ones, "though I confess I have feared it for some time now. You deserve so much more than this house has given you, my dear. I only wish circumstances were different." "You have given me a home when I had none," Clara said gently, her own eyes damp with unshed tears. "I will never forget your kindness, my lady. Not for as long as I live." "And I will never forget yours," the Duchess replied, squeezing her hand with what strength remained to her. "Where will you go?" Clara hesitated only a moment before answering. Through Grace's connections, and a warm letter of recommendation Lady Margaret herself insisted on writing despite her failing health, Clara had secured a position as governess to the two young daughters of a respected family in a neighboring county, a household known for its kindness toward its staff and its genuine warmth. It was, Clara had come to understand over the past weeks, precisely the sort of fresh start she needed, close enough that she might still visit those she loved, far enough that she could finally build a life entirely her own. "There is a family near Ashworth Village," Clara explained. "The Farrows, two young daughters in need of a governess. Lord Ashworth recommended me himself once he learned of my situation." "A fine family," Lady Margaret said approvingly, though her voice carried a note of sorrow beneath the approval. "You will be happy there, I think. Or at the very least, you will finally have the chance to discover what happiness looks like, outside these walls." Clara found she could not speak past the tightness in her throat, and simply pressed a gentle kiss to the Duchess's frail hand, grateful beyond words, for a woman who had given her so much and who now, even in illness, offered her blessing to leave. Telling Henry proved almost as difficult. The old butler, upon hearing Clara's news, was quiet for a long moment, his kind face working through some private struggle before he finally spoke. "This house will not be the same without you, Miss Bennet," he said simply. "I have watched you grow from a frightened girl into the very heart of this household's daily life. I confess I had hoped, in my more foolish moments, that the Duke might someday come to see what the rest of us have seen for years." Clara managed a small, sad smile. "Some hopes are not meant to become reality, Henry. I have made my peace with that, I think, or I am learning to." "Then I wish you every happiness in your new position," Henry said, his voice thick with genuine emotion as he clasped her hand warmly. "And should you ever need anything at all, you need only send word. This household owes you a debt it can never properly repay." The hardest task of all, however, was deciding how and whether to tell Alden. In the end, Clara chose not to seek him out directly. It was not cowardice, though she suspected some might see it that way. It was, rather, a final act of the same quiet dignity she had brought to every year of her service, a refusal to turn her departure into a dramatic confrontation that might force from him some hollow apology or belated recognition that would only cheapen the honest grief she carried. She would leave a letter instead, brief and proper, explaining her departure in the simplest terms, and trust that whatever understanding eventually came to him would come in its own time, not because she had demanded it. She spent her final days at Ashfield Manor ensuring everything was in perfect order for whoever might follow her. She trained a capable young maid named Susan Pratt in the details of managing the household accounts, walked Henry through every small system she had built over 9 years to keep the estate running smoothly, and sat with Lady Margaret each evening for as long as her duties allowed, memorizing, quietly, the particular warmth of the old woman's presence, knowing these evenings were numbered. Alden, consumed by wedding preparations that had only intensified since the engagement ball, seemed to notice little of the quiet farewell taking shape around him. He passed Clara in the hallways with his usual polite nod, thanked her absently when she brought him corrected accounts or reminded him of some scheduled obligation, entirely unaware that each of these small, ordinary exchanges was, in truth, one of the last times they would ever occur. It was only on Clara's final evening at Ashfield Manor, as she packed the last of her modest belongings into a single worn trunk, that she allowed herself one last, private moment of grief. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the small room around her stripped bare of the few personal touches she had accumulated over 9 years, and looked around at the space that had been, for so long, the only home she had known. There was little to show for 9 years of devotion. A handful of books, a few pieces of simple jewelry that had belonged to her mother, the blue silk gown Lady Margaret had insisted she keep. It seemed, somehow, like such a small collection to represent nearly a decade of her life, and yet Clara found she did not regret the years themselves, only the quiet, patient hope she had allowed to consume so much of them. She thought of Alden by the library fire, admitting his doubts about a marriage built on duty rather than love. She thought of the brief, searching look he had given her across the crowded ballroom before Cassandra's cruelty had swept the moment away entirely. She thought, too, of Edmund Hale's easy warmth at the market stall, of a conversation that had asked nothing of her beyond her own honest company. Perhaps, Clara thought, folding the last of her belongings carefully into the trunk, she was not leaving Ashfield Manor in defeat, as some quiet part of her had feared these past weeks. Perhaps she was simply, finally, choosing herself, after 9 years of choosing everyone and everything else first. The letter she left for Alden was placed on his study desk that same night, where he would find it the following morning after her departure. It was brief, carefully worded, offering her resignation with proper notice and gratitude for the years she had spent in his family's service, mentioning nothing of her feelings, nothing of 9 years of quiet love, nothing of the humiliation at the engagement ball that had finally pushed her toward this decision. It was, Clara decided, not his burden to carry, not anymore. She had carried enough for both of them for long enough. She left Ashfield Manor before dawn the next morning, in a small carriage arranged by Lord Ashworth's household to carry her to her new position with the Farrow family. Only Grace and Henry were awake to see her off, standing together in the cold, gray light of early morning as the carriage waited on the gravel drive. "Write to me," Grace said fiercely, embracing her friend tightly. "Every week, or I shall come find you myself and drag the letters out of you personally." Clara laughed despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Every week," she promised. Henry, ever proper, simply bowed formally and then, breaking entirely with propriety, pulled Clara into a brief, warm embrace. "This house will feel your absence keenly, Miss Bennet," he said quietly, "as will those of us who have had the privilege of knowing you." Clara climbed into the carriage with her single worn trunk, and as it pulled away down the long gravel drive, she allowed herself one final look back at Ashfield Manor, its grand stone walls rising against the pale winter sky, its windows still dark in the early hour, the only home she had known for 9 years growing smaller and smaller behind her until, finally, the carriage rounded a bend in the road, and the house disappeared from view entirely. She did not cry, though she had expected she might. Instead, she felt something unexpected settle over her, quiet and unfamiliar, something that took her several miles of travel to properly recognize. It was relief. Behind her lay 9 years of careful, quiet devotion to a love that had never once been returned in the way her heart had hoped for. Ahead of her lay something entirely uncertain, a new household, new responsibilities, a life built on her own choices rather than her own quiet, patient waiting. It was frightening, in its own way, but beneath the fear, Clara found something she had not felt in longer than she could remember. Hope, not the fragile, waiting hope she had carried for 9 years within Ashfield Manor's walls, but something sturdier, something that belonged entirely to her, unattached to any single person's notice or affection. The Farrow estate, when the carriage finally arrived late that afternoon, proved smaller than Ashfield Manor but no less welcoming. A comfortable stone house surrounded by well-kept gardens, warm light glowing from its windows despite the gray winter afternoon. Mrs. Farrow herself came out to greet the carriage, a warm, plainly dressed woman with kind eyes and an easy smile, and behind her, 2 young girls peered curiously from the doorway, whispering excitedly to one another at the arrival of their new governess. "Miss Bennet," Mrs. Farrow said warmly, extending her hand as Clara stepped down from the carriage. "We are so glad you've arrived safely. The girls have been asking after you all week." "I'm very glad to be here," Clara said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it entirely. The days that followed brought their own gentle rhythm, entirely different from the quiet, careful devotion Clara had practiced for 9 years at Ashfield Manor. The Farrow daughters, Lucy and little Margaret, named coincidentally after the very Duchess Clara had left behind, proved bright and eager pupils, delighted by Clara's patient teaching and gentle humor. Mrs. Farrow treated Clara with genuine warmth and respect, consulting her opinion on the children's education with real interest rather than the distant courtesy Clara had grown accustomed to at Ashfield Manor. For the first time in 9 years, Clara found herself valued not simply for her usefulness, but for her own thoughts, her own judgment, her own presence within a household that had welcomed her, from the very first day, as something more than a quiet fixture in the background. She wrote to Grace every week, exactly as promised, filling her letters with small, warm details of her new life, the girls' progress in their studies, Mrs. Farrow's kindness, the gentle, unremarkable comfort of a life built entirely on her own terms. She did not write of Ashfield Manor or of Alden, though she thought of them both more often than she cared to admit, especially in the quiet hours before sleep, when old habits of the heart proved harder to unlearn than she had hoped. She did not know in those first weeks at the Farrow estate that behind her, at Ashfield Manor, her absence had already begun to unravel something the household had long taken entirely for granted. Alden found the letter on his study desk the morning after Clara's departure, exactly where she had left it, sitting atop a neat stack of household papers as though it were nothing more than routine correspondence. He read it twice before the words truly settled into meaning, and even then, some part of him refused, for several long minutes, to believe what was plainly written before him. Miss Bennet had resigned her position. She had left Ashfield Manor before dawn that very morning, taking up a new post as governess to a family in a neighboring county. He sat back in his chair, the letter loose in his hand, and found himself, for reasons he could not immediately name, genuinely shaken by the news. It was absurd, he told himself. Companions came and went. Households adjusted. There was no reason her departure should feel like anything more than a minor inconvenience requiring a replacement to be found in due course. And yet the study felt strangely empty without the quiet, familiar presence of someone who had, for 9 years, kept its ledgers in perfect order, who had always known precisely which papers required his signature, and which could wait, who had managed 1,000 small details of his household's daily life so seamlessly that he had scarcely noticed the sheer scope of what she accomplished, until, quite suddenly, she was no longer there to accomplish it. He summoned Henry immediately, demanding an explanation, and the old butler, standing before him with carefully composed features that could not entirely hide his own grief, offered what details he felt appropriate to share. "Miss Bennet gave proper notice, Your Grace," Henry said. "She trained young Susan Pratt thoroughly in her responsibilities before her departure, and left the household's accounts in excellent order. Her decision was, I believe, a long time in the making." "But why?" Alden pressed, unable to fully articulate the strange, unsettled feeling churning in his chest. "She never once mentioned any dissatisfaction with her position here." Henry hesitated, a rare occurrence for a man who had served the household with unwavering discretion for decades, and something in that hesitation told Alden there was a great deal more to the story than he currently understood. "Speak plainly, Henry," Alden said. "I would have the truth of it." "Very well, Your Grace." Henry drew a steadying breath. "Miss Bennet has served this household with extraordinary devotion for 9 years, often at considerable personal cost, and with very little recognition for the full extent of her contributions. I believe the events of the engagement ball and Lady Cassandra's treatment of her that evening played no small part in her decision to seek a life elsewhere." Alden frowned, an uncomfortable memory surfacing, Cassandra's cool smile, the small crowd of guests, Clara's carefully composed expression that had not, he now realized with a sinking feeling, entirely masked genuine distress. He had dismissed the tension that evening as some minor social friction, easily resolved, and moved on without a second thought. "What precisely occurred that evening?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Henry, with evident reluctance but unwavering honesty, relayed what he had heard from several members of the staff who had witnessed the exchange. Cassandra's public humiliation of Clara before a crowd of guests, her cutting remarks about Clara's position within the household, the clear insinuation that Clara harbored improper ambitions toward the Duke himself. By the time Henry finished, Alden sat in stunned, growing horror, piecing together, far too late, the true weight of what had transpired directly beside him that evening, while he had walked away without a single word in Clara's defense. "And I did nothing," Alden said quietly, more to himself than to Henry. "I walked away and left her standing there." "You were not aware of the full circumstances, Your Grace," Henry offered, though his tone carried little genuine absolution. Alden did not answer immediately. He rose from his desk and walked to the window, staring out at the winter garden below, bare and gray beneath a pale sky, thinking with mounting unease of 9 years he had scarcely examined closely, 9 years during which Clara Bennett had managed his household, cared for his ailing mother, quietly corrected countless small crises before they ever reached his attention, and asked for nothing in return beyond, perhaps, the simple courtesy of being seen. Over the following days, as word of Clara's departure spread through the household and beyond, the full extent of what she had quietly carried became increasingly, uncomfortably clear. Susan Pratt, the young maid Clara had trained to manage the accounts, struggled to maintain the same seamless order Clara had achieved so effortlessly, and small errors began surfacing. A delayed payment here, a miscalculated expense there, nothing catastrophic, but enough to reveal, in aggregate, precisely how much skill and attention Clara's work had always required. Lady Margaret, without Clara's steady evening presence, grew visibly more fragile, her spirits noticeably dimmed despite the staff's best efforts to fill the gap Clara had left behind. When Alden visited his mother's rooms one evening, he found her staring out the window with a distant, sorrowful expression entirely unlike her usual sharp wit. "You look troubled, Mother," he said, settling into the chair beside her bed. "I am troubled," Lady Margaret said, turning to look at him with an intensity that made him distinctly uncomfortable. "Tell me, Alden, do you know how many nights Clara Bennett sat beside this very bed, through fevers and coughs and sleepless hours, simply because she loved me enough to give up her own rest for my comfort?" Alden shifted uneasily. "I know she was devoted to your care, Mother." "Devoted," Lady Margaret repeated, with a note of quiet bitterness he had rarely heard from her. "Devoted is too small a word for what that girl gave this family and gave you for 9 long years, while receiving so very little in return." She studied her son's face carefully, and whatever she saw there seemed to soften her tone slightly. "Did you know she loved you, Alden?" The question landed like a physical blow, and Alden found himself entirely unable to formulate a response. His mind racing back through 9 years of small, quiet moments he had never once examined closely enough to recognize their true weight. Clara's careful attentiveness to his moods, her quiet efficiency in managing every burden he had scarcely noticed carrying, the searching look in her eyes across the crowded ballroom the night of the engagement announcement, the library fire, and the conversation that had felt, even then, like it teetered on the edge of something neither of them had been brave enough to name. "I did not know," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Or perhaps I chose not to see it." "Perhaps you did," Lady Margaret said gently, though there was no real forgiveness in her tone, only weary honesty. "It is a particular kind of blindness, my son, to overlook the person who has loved you most faithfully simply because that love never announced itself loudly enough to demand your attention. Clara Bennett never once asked anything of you. And so you never once thought to wonder what she might have wanted, had she felt free to ask." Alden sat in heavy silence, the weight of his mother's words settling over him with growing, uncomfortable clarity. Somewhere beneath the careful, dutiful life he had built for himself, engagement to Cassandra Vale, an estate secured against financial ruin, obligations dutifully met, a quiet, persistent unease had been growing for weeks, a sense that something essential was missing from the future he had so carefully arranged for himself. He had told himself it was simply the natural anxiety of any man approaching marriage. Now, sitting beside his mother in the fading evening light, he began to understand that the unease had a name, and that name had quietly packed a single worn trunk and left Ashfield Manor before dawn nearly 2 weeks earlier. It was Cassandra herself who, quite unwittingly, finally shattered whatever remained of Alden's careful denial. He found her one afternoon in the drawing room, deep in conversation with her lady's maid, discussing plans for redecorating the east wing once the wedding had taken place. He had come to discuss a matter of wedding logistics, but paused in the doorway, unnoticed, as he overheard the tail end of their conversation. And once we've settled the staff reorganization, I intend to see that companion of the old Duchess's position filled with someone more suitable, Cassandra was saying, entirely unaware of his presence. Though I confess, her sudden departure has spared me the trouble of dismissing her myself. Convenient timing, really, all things considered. "Did you have something to do with her leaving, my lady?" the maid asked, and Alden's entire body went still, waiting for the answer with a dread he could not fully explain. Cassandra's laugh was light, careless, utterly without remorse. "Let us simply say I made my expectations for this household's future quite clear, and Miss Bennet proved wise enough to understand there was no place for her within it. A small mercy, honestly. The woman was entirely too devoted to Alden for my comfort. I have eyes, whatever anyone believes of my perception. She loved him. Anyone with sense could see it plainly enough, everyone except Alden himself, it seems." The casual cruelty in her voice, the calculated satisfaction at having driven Clara away, struck Alden with a force that left him momentarily breathless. He stepped fully into the doorway, and Cassandra's expression shifted instantly at the sight of him, calculation quickly masked beneath an unconvincing smile. "Alden, darling, I didn't hear you come in." "Clearly not," he said, his voice carrying a coldness Cassandra had never before heard from him. "Tell me plainly, Cassandra. Did you drive Miss Bennet from this household?" Cassandra's composure faltered slightly, though she recovered quickly, lifting her chin with practiced confidence. "I merely made clear that certain arrangements would need to change once we were married. If the woman chose to leave rather than accept a household run according to my standards, that hardly reflects poorly on me." "You humiliated her at our engagement ball in front of half the county," Alden said, the pieces settling into place with sickening clarity. "You threatened her position, insulted her worth, and drove away a woman who had given this family 9 years of unwavering devotion, simply because her presence inconvenienced your vision for our future." "Alden, really, you're making far too much of this," Cassandra said, though a flicker of genuine alarm had entered her voice now. "She was a servant, nothing more. I hardly see why her departure should trouble you so deeply." "She was never merely a servant," Alden said quietly. And in that moment, standing in the drawing room with the full weight of 9 years of blindness finally crashing down upon him, he understood, with sudden and total clarity, precisely what Clara Bennet had meant to this household, and to him personally, and precisely how badly he had failed to recognize it while it remained within his reach. He said nothing further to Cassandra that day, though the conversation that followed in the days after, once he had gathered his thoughts sufficiently to address the matter properly, would end their engagement entirely, much to the shock of both families and the considerable scandal of the county. Cassandra's true character, once glimpsed clearly, could not be unseen, and Alden found he had no desire to build a life or secure his family's future upon a foundation of such calculated cruelty. But ending the engagement, he understood immediately, solved only half the problem before him. Clara Bennet was gone, had been gone for weeks now, building a new life in a household that had welcomed her, it seemed, with far more genuine warmth than Ashfield Manor had ever managed to offer her. He did not know, standing alone in his study that evening with 9 years of overlooked devotion weighing heavily on his conscience, whether it was already too late to make things right. But he knew, with a certainty that had eluded him for far too long, that he intended to try. News of the broken engagement reached Clara nearly a month after her arrival at the Farrow estate, carried in one of Grace's weekly letters filled with details from the village, and this time, a piece of news that made Clara's hands tremble as she read it. "You will hardly believe what has happened here," Grace had written. "The engagement between the Duke and Lady Cassandra has been called off entirely. The whole county is speaking of nothing else. Henry tells me the Duke discovered something of Lady Cassandra's true character, and ended things swiftly once he understood the full truth of it. I confess I do not know all the details, but I thought you would want to know." Clara read the letter 3 times before setting it carefully aside, her mind a confused tangle of feelings she could not immediately sort through. She told herself firmly that the news changed nothing about her own life, her own choices, the fresh start she had built for herself at the Farrow estate over the past weeks. She had left Ashfield Manor to escape a life of quiet, unrequited waiting, not to wait, from a distance now, for some different outcome entirely. And yet, in the quiet hours of that evening, after the Farrow girls had gone to bed, and the house had settled into its familiar evening hush, Clara found herself sitting by her window, staring out at the darkened garden below, thinking of Alden more intensely than she had allowed herself to in weeks. She did not know, of course, of the conversation that had taken place in the drawing room, of Lady Margaret's pointed words beside her sickbed, of the slow, painful reckoning that had settled over Ashfield Manor's master in the weeks since her departure. She knew only that the engagement had ended, and that knowledge, however she tried to keep it separate from her own carefully rebuilt peace, refused to settle quietly within her. It was nearly 2 weeks later, on an unremarkable gray afternoon, while Clara sat in the schoolroom helping young Lucy Farrow with her penmanship, that Mrs. Farrow appeared in the doorway with an expression of mild surprise. "Miss Bennet, you have a visitor," she said. "A gentleman waiting in the front parlor." Clara's first thought, absurdly, was of Edmund Hale, who had written to her twice since her departure from Ashfield Manor, warm, easy letters that asked for nothing beyond her continued friendship. But something in Mrs. Farrow's careful tone suggested a visitor of far greater significance, and Clara's heart began to pound with a mixture of hope and dread she could not fully name as she smoothed her skirts and made her way toward the front parlor. She stopped in the doorway, her breath catching entirely at the sight of Alden Whitmore standing near the window, his traveling coat still dusted from the road, his expression carrying none of the polished composure she had always associated with him. He looked, instead, tired and uncertain, a man who had traveled a considerable distance without entirely knowing what he intended to say once he arrived. "Your Grace," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, every careful wall she had built over the past month threatening to crumble at the mere sight of him. "Clara," Alden said, and the use of her given name without title or formality struck her with unexpected force. "Forgive me for arriving without warning. I did not know how else to say what I have come to say, except to say it plainly, in person." Clara stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak, as Alden crossed the room slowly, stopping a respectful distance away, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity she had glimpsed only once before, across a crowded ballroom, moments before Cassandra's cruelty had swept it away entirely. "I have spent the past month learning things about myself that I am not proud of," he began, his voice carrying a rawness she had never heard from him before. "I learned that I allowed a woman to be humiliated in my own home, and said nothing in her defense, because I was too blind or too cowardly to recognize what her presence in my life truly meant. I learned that 9 years of devotion, care, and quiet sacrifice had been given to me, and to my family so seamlessly that I mistook it for nothing more than duty, when it was, in truth, love, offered patiently and without any demand for recognition." Clara's eyes filled with tears she could not hold back, though she remained silent, allowing him to continue, needing, desperately, to hear whatever remained unspoken. "I ended my engagement to Cassandra," Alden continued, "not simply because I discovered her cruelty, though that alone would have been reason enough, but because I finally understood, in the weeks since your departure, that I had been preparing to build a life around the wrong person entirely, while the person who had already, quietly, become essential to my happiness had walked out of my life without my ever having the courage to tell her so." "Alden," Clara whispered, his name feeling strange and precious on her tongue after so many years of careful formality. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you," he said quickly, as though fearing his courage might fail him if he paused too long. "I know I failed to see you, for 9 years, in all the ways that mattered most. I know you have built a new life here, one that seems, from everything Grace has told Henry, to be a genuinely happy one. I did not come to disrupt that happiness, Clara. I came only to tell you the truth I should have told you a very long time ago. I love you." I believe I have loved you for years, quietly, without ever allowing myself to examine the feeling closely enough to name it. And I could not continue building a life without at least giving you the chance to know that truth, whatever you choose to do with it. The parlor fell into profound silence, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the distant sound of the Pharaoh girl's laughter drifting from somewhere upstairs. Clara stood very still, her heart pounding, 9 years of quiet, patient hope colliding, suddenly and overwhelmingly, with the reality of hearing those exact words spoken aloud, finally, after so long a wait. "You hurt me terribly," she said finally, her voice trembling but steady enough to be heard clearly. "Not only at the ball, though that wound cuts deeply enough on its own, but in 9 years of small moments where I hoped, foolishly perhaps, that you might see me as something more than useful. I cannot simply set that hurt aside because you have finally arrived at understanding, however sincerely." "I would not ask you to," Alden said quietly. "I do not expect forgiveness simply because I have finally found the courage to speak the truth. I only ask that you allow me the chance to prove, over time, that I have truly changed, that I see you now fully and intend to keep seeing you, for as long as you will permit it." Clara studied his face carefully, searching for any trace of the careless blindness that had defined so much of their history together, and found instead something she had glimpsed only rarely in 9 years, genuine vulnerability, entirely unguarded. A man who had traveled a considerable distance not out of duty or obligation, but out of a love he had finally allowed himself to fully recognize and claim. "I need time," she said finally, echoing, without quite realizing it, the very words she had spoken to Grace months before on the old stone bench in Ashfield's gardens. "I have built something of my own here, Alden, something that values me for more than my usefulness. I will not abandon that lightly, not even for you." "I would not ask you to," he repeated, and something like hope flickered gently across his tired features. "Take whatever time you need, Clara. I will wait for as long as necessary, and I will prove, through actions rather than words alone, that the man standing before you today is not the same man who once let you walk away without a fight." Clara did not answer immediately, her heart still tangled in 9 years of complicated feeling. But as she studied Alden's earnest, hopeful expression, she found, for the first time, that the possibility of a future between them no longer felt like a fragile, foolish hope she had to guard carefully against disappointment. It felt instead like a genuine choice, freely offered and freely hers to accept or decline on her own terms in her own time. "You may write to me," she said finally, allowing the smallest hint of warmth into her voice. "As a friend for now. We shall see, Alden, what grows from honest beginnings, rather than 9 years of quiet assumptions." A genuine smile broke across Alden's face, relief and gratitude mingling openly in his expression. "That is more than I dared to hope for," he said softly. "Thank you, Clara, for hearing me even after everything." He took his leave shortly after, understanding, with evident respect, that Clara needed space to process all that had been said. And as his carriage pulled away from the Pharaoh estate that afternoon, Clara stood at the window watching it disappear down the country road, her heart a complicated tangle of old wounds and new, cautious hope. She did not know, standing there in the fading afternoon light, precisely what the future held. But for the first time in 9 long years, she found that she was no longer simply waiting to be seen. She had already been seen by an old duchess who valued her fully, by a kind gentleman who asked nothing but honest company, by 2 young girls who adored her without reservation, and now, finally, however imperfectly and however late, by the man she had loved quietly for so long. Whatever came next, Clara understood, would be built on her own terms, and that, she realized with quiet, growing certainty, made all the difference in the world. The months that followed carried a quiet, steady rhythm, entirely different from the anxious waiting that had once defined Clara's heart. Alden wrote to her faithfully, letters filled not with grand declarations but with small, honest details of his days, the estate's slow recovery from years of financial strain, his mother's health improving gradually with the arrival of warmer weather, his own quiet efforts to become a better steward of the household his family had built. Clara wrote back with equal honesty, sharing stories of Lucy and little Margaret's progress in their studies, the small satisfactions of a life built on her own choices, and slowly, cautiously, the tender beginnings of feelings she no longer needed to hide away like an unsent letter. He visited twice more over the following months, each time with the same patient respect for whatever pace Clara needed, never pressing for more than she was ready to offer. On his second visit, in early summer, he brought with him a letter from Lady Margaret, whose health had improved enough that she had taken up correspondence again, her familiar sharp wit fully restored. "My dear Clara," the letter read, "I hear from my son that you have been gracious enough to allow him a place in your life once more, however cautiously offered. I confess I could not be more pleased. I have watched that boy love you for years without the sense to recognize it himself, and it does my old heart good to know he has finally found his way to understanding what the rest of us saw so clearly all along. Whatever you decide, know that you will always have a place in this family, Clara, not as a companion or a servant, but as someone who has been loved and valued far more than we ever properly expressed. Come visit an old woman soon if your duties allow. I have missed you terribly." Clara wept reading that letter, grateful tears this time, entirely different from the grief she had carried away from Ashfield Manor months before. It was nearly a year after her departure that Clara finally returned to Ashfield Manor, not as a companion managing the household's daily affairs, but as a guest, invited properly and warmly by Lady Margaret herself, who insisted on hosting a small gathering to celebrate her continued recovery. Clara arrived to find the house much as she remembered it, grand stone walls and tall windows, gardens now blooming fully with the warmth of early summer, and yet everything about her presence there felt entirely different from the 9 years she had spent within its walls before. Alden met her carriage personally, something he had never once done during her years of service, and the warmth in his expression as he helped her down from the carriage carried none of the distracted courtesy she had grown so accustomed to in years past. "Welcome back," he said simply, though the words carried a weight far beyond their simplicity. The gathering that afternoon was small and warm, Lady Margaret presiding from a comfortable chair in the garden, Henry overseeing the refreshments with evident joy at Clara's return, Grace arriving with news of her own recent engagement to a kind young solicitor from the village. Edmund Hale sent his warm regards from his own estate, along with news that he had recently become engaged himself to a woman he had met during his travels, a development that brought Clara genuine happiness rather than any lingering regret. Their friendship, she had come to understand, had never needed to become anything more than what it was, a gentle, honest connection that had helped her recognize her own worth during a time when she had most needed to see it clearly. It was in the garden that evening, as the gathering wound down and golden summer light stretched long shadows across the lawn, that Alden finally found a private moment alone with Clara, walking together along the same gravel paths where she had once wept quietly on an old stone bench, grieving a love she had believed would never be returned. "Do you remember this bench?" Alden asked, gesturing toward the familiar stone seat beneath the rose bushes, now blooming fully with the season. "I remember it very well," Clara said softly, a small smile touching her lips despite the bittersweet memory it carried. "I spent a great many quiet evenings here over the years. Grace told me once that she found you crying here the night I announced my engagement to Cassandra," Alden said quietly. "I think of that often, Clara, of everything you carried silently for so many years, while I remained entirely blind to it." "You are not the same man now," Clara said gently, turning to face him fully. "I have watched you these past months, in your letters, in your visits, in the quiet, steady way you have proven your intentions without ever once pressing me for more than I was ready to give. That man deserves to be judged on his own merits, not endlessly measured against the mistakes of the past." Alden's expression softened with evident relief and gratitude, and he reached, carefully, to take her hand in his. "Then may I ask you something here, in this very garden, where you once believed your love for me would never be seen or returned." Clara's breath caught, her heart pounding, though this time, the anticipation carried none of the fragile, fearful hope of years past. This time, she understood fully, whatever answer came would be built on honest ground, freely chosen by both of them. "You may ask," she said softly. Alden knelt there among the blooming roses, and asked Clara Bennett to become his wife, not out of duty or obligation, not to settle debts or secure an estate's future, but simply because he loved her, fully and finally, and could no longer imagine a life that did not include her standing beside him, seen and valued exactly as she deserved to be. Clara said yes, her voice steady and certain, 9 years of quiet waiting finally giving way to a love freely offered and freely chosen, built not on patient hope alone, but on the genuine understanding two people can only reach when one finally finds the courage to truly see the other, however long that recognition takes to arrive. They were married the following autumn, in a small, warm ceremony attended by those who had watched their story unfold with genuine affection. Lady Margaret radiant with happiness despite her continued frailty, Grace serving proudly as Clara's closest companion, Henry beaming with quiet pride throughout the entire celebration. Clara wore no borrowed gown that day, but one entirely her own, chosen and made specifically for the occasion, a small but meaningful symbol of everything that had changed since the last time she had stood in Ashfield Manor's grand ballroom, invisible and unseen. In the years that followed, Clara never forgot the lessons of those difficult months, the quiet strength she had discovered in choosing herself, the genuine happiness she had built entirely on her own terms before ever allowing love back into her life. She continued, even as Duchess, to value the quiet, unseen labor of those around her, remembering always how easily devotion could be overlooked when it never demanded attention for itself. Alden, for his part, never again allowed himself the comfortable blindness that had once cost him 9 years of recognizing what stood quietly beside him all along. Their love, when it finally bloomed fully, carried a depth and honesty that 9 years of unspoken hoping could never have achieved on its own. A partnership built not on one person's patient waiting, but on mutual recognition, freely given and gratefully received, proof that sometimes the truest love is not the one that arrives easily, but the one that finally learns, however late, to truly see.